The radio operator at the Russian Regional Logistics Coordination Center in Svatove sent his routine fuel status report at 0417 on a Tuesday morning. By the time he sent his next one, 19 hours later, the numbers he was transmitting no longer described an army. They described a problem with no solution available in the time he had left to solve it. He did not know that yet. The men in the forward positions outside Kreminna and along the approaches to Lyman did not know it yet either. They were still operating on the assumption that the system behind them was intact, that the trucks would arrive on the established schedule, that the diesel reserves at the intermediate depots were where the maps said they were. None of those assumptions would survive the next sunrise. This is not a story about a successful long-range strike campaign. There were many of those, and most of them deserve their own analysis. This is a story about what happens when a modern army discovers, in a window of hours rather than days, that the network it has spent 2 years building behind its own lines was not actually a network at all. It was a chain. And in my experience studying logistics in extended conflicts, the difference between a chain and a network is the difference between an army that can absorb a bad week and an army that runs dry in front of its own trenches with the enemy still in contact. What Ukraine did in Luhansk Oblast over a single concentrated operational window was not novel in its tools. It was novel in its understanding of what the tools were actually for. And before this analysis is finished, I want you to see why the Russian fuel crisis at the front was not a consequence of the strikes. The strikes were a consequence of a vulnerability that had been quietly maturing for the better part of a year. Let me begin with the assumption that did the most damage, because every operational failure of this kind has one. The Russian logistics architecture in occupied Luhansk had been built around a doctrine that in its original form was entirely sound. Concentrate fuel and ammunition at a small number of large, hardened, well-defended hub sites, positioned far enough behind the line of contact to sit outside the range of standard tube and rocket artillery. From those hubs, push forward to a second tier of intermediate depots, and from the intermediate depots, distribute by truck to the units in contact. This is a model that has worked in conflicts going back nearly a century. It compresses defensive resources around a small number of critical nodes. It simplifies inventory control. It allows rear area security forces to focus their attention on locations they can actually defend. The reasoning is established. The reasoning is also, on this battlefield, no longer applicable in the form Russia was using it. Here is what had changed without being fully internalized in the planning. The hub-and-spoke model assumes that the strike radius of the enemy is limited and predictable. It assumes that hardening a site against artillery is functionally equivalent to hardening it against deep strike. It assumes that the enemy's targeting cycle is slow enough that a hub, once concealed and camouflaged, can sit in place for weeks or months without being precisely located. Every one of those assumptions had been quietly disproven over the preceding 18 months, and yet the architecture had not been redesigned to reflect what the disproof actually meant. The hubs in Starobilsk, Svatova, and the rail-served sites east of Rovenki were larger than they had been a year earlier, not smaller, not more dispersed, larger, because the war required more throughput, and the doctrine said to concentrate throughput. The doctrine was eating itself, and no one in the chain of command was positioned to say so out loud. This is the original sin, and I want you to sit with it for a moment, because everything that followed flowed from it. Russia did not lose its forward fuel because Ukraine struck cleverly. Russia lost its forward fuel because the system Russia had built was, by the time of the strike, the worst possible configuration for the threat environment it was actually operating in. Concentrated, predictable, rail-dependent, hub-anchored, a network designed for a war that was not being fought, defending positions in a war that was. Now layer the conditions on top of that architecture. By late autumn, 3 factors had compressed around the Russian logistics posture in ways that the operators on the ground felt, but the planners above them did not fully account for. The first was the deterioration of the rail network's redundancy. Repeated strikes on bridges and signaling infrastructure had reduced the number of viable routes feeding the eastern Luhansk hubs from 4 to effectively 2. Both of those routes converged at a small number of marshalling points, which meant that the entire fuel inflow for a sector containing the better part of 40,000 troops was now flowing through a topology that a single competent targeting officer could draw on a napkin. The second factor was seasonal. Mud season had arrived early and arrived hard, which meant that the truck distribution from intermediate depots forward to units in contact was now slower, more fuel-intensive per ton delivered, and more dependent on a small number of metalled roads. And the third factor, the most important one, was that Russia's electronic warfare assets had been heavily redeployed southward to support operations near Zaporizhia, leaving the Luhansk rear areas with thinner protective coverage than they had enjoyed at any point in the previous 12 months. The seams were widening, the architecture was concentrating, the cover was thinning. None of this was visible as crisis from inside the Russian system because each individual factor was within tolerance. The problem was that the factors were correlating, and correlated stress is not the same as cumulative stress. Correlated stress collapses a system rather than degrading it. Ukraine did not strike when it had the capability to strike. That window had existed for weeks. Ukraine struck when the correlation matured. There is a distinction in serious military planning between possessing a capability and applying it at the moment of maximum effect. And the gap between those two is where amateur planners reveal themselves. The amateur strikes when the target is available. The professional strikes when the target's failure will cascade. The Ukrainian Deep Strike Directorate, working with the relevant intelligence elements and with partners I will not name in this analysis, had been mapping the Russian logistics topology in Luhansk for the better part of 6 months. Fuel storage signatures, rail loading patterns, the thermal behavior of pumping infrastructure at different times of day, the frequency and routing of fuel truck convoys leaving the intermediate depots, the locations where camouflage had been allowed to degrade because the responsible officer had been rotated. None of this was secret in any meaningful sense. All of it was visible to a force willing to invest the analytical effort. Ukraine invested that effort and then waited until the rail bottlenecks, the mud, and the EW gap aligned. That alignment occurred in the 3rd week of October. The operation that followed was conducted across approximately 31 hours, used a combination of long-range strike systems, whose specifics matter less than their targeting logic, and was structured around a principle that I want to draw your attention to because it is the doctrinal heart of what made this operation work. Logistics power, like armored power, rests on twin pillars: storage and flow. You can have all the fuel in the world stockpiled in your rear areas, and if it cannot flow forward at the rate the front consumes it, the stockpile is operationally meaningless. Conversely, you can have an excellent distribution network with nothing in it to distribute. Remove either pillar and the other becomes a museum exhibit. The Russian planners had built a system that was over-optimized for storage and under-optimized for flow. And Ukraine designed an operation that attacked both pillars in a specific sequence calculated to make recovery from either failure impossible in the available time frame. The first wave did not strike the hubs. This is the detail that separates this operation from a conventional interdiction campaign, and I want you to understand why. Striking the hubs first would have been the obvious move. It would also have given Russia the maximum opportunity to surge fuel forward from the intermediate depots before the second-tier sites were neutralized. The first wave instead struck the flow nodes, the pumping stations, the rail loading gantries at 2 of the 3 primary marshalling points, a specific bridge east of Svatove that carried both rail and road traffic and had been quietly carrying a disproportionate share of fuel tonnage since the alternate northern route had been damaged 6 weeks earlier. The intent was not to destroy fuel. The intent was to ensure that fuel, which was about to be in the wrong place, would not be able to move to the right place once the second wave arrived. Russia's immediate response to a hub strike would have been to dispatch trucks. Russia's immediate response to a flow strike was confusion, because the hubs were still intact and the system told the operators that they should still be functional, even though the connective tissue between the hubs and the front had just been severed in 3 places. The second wave, 6 to 9 hours later depending on the target, struck the intermediate depots. By this point, Russia had identified that something serious was underway, and the defensive response that followed was tactically coherent. Air defense assets were repositioned, counter-battery radars were activated, decoy fires were initiated at locations meant to attract follow-on strikes away from the real high-value sites. Russian commanders did not freeze. They did what they had been trained to do, and what they had been trained to do was the correct response to a conventional interdiction campaign of the type that had been waged against logistics for the previous century. The problem was that this was not a conventional interdiction campaign. The strikes were not seeking to destroy fuel in the largest available quantities. The strikes were seeking to fragment the system's ability to redistribute fuel internally once the strikes ended. The intermediate depots were not hit at their main storage points. They were hit at their truck loading bays, their generator sets, and their administrative coordination buildings. The fuel in the tanks was, in many cases, still there at the end of the wave. But the ability to get that fuel into trucks and onto roads had been removed in a way that would take days or weeks to restore, and the front needed the fuel that night. The third wave, arriving the following morning, under conditions of degraded Russian situational awareness, because the communications nodes had been part of the second wave's target set, struck the hubs themselves. By this point, the strike was almost an afterthought in operational terms. The hubs had already been functionally isolated from the front by the destruction of the flow architecture. Destroying the hubs simply ensured that recovery could not be improvised by drawing down strategic reserves and pushing them forward through alternate channels. The sequencing here is what I want serious students of this conflict to understand. Flow nodes first, distribution capability second, storage last. This is the opposite of how most armies, including some I have served alongside, would instinctively prioritize the same target set. Most planners reach for storage first because storage is where the fuel is. Ukraine reached for flow first because flow is where the war is. By the second sunset of the operation, Russian units in contact along a frontage of roughly 90 kilometers were reporting fuel states that ranged from constrained to critical. The forward battalion tactical groups operating in the wooded approaches west of Crimea had between 8 and 14 hours of operational diesel remaining at normal consumption rates. The artillery groups providing support fires for the Svatova axis were rationing prime mover fuel, which meant that displacement after firing, the single most important survival behavior for tube artillery in a counter-battery environment, was being curtailed. Generator fuel at command posts was being reallocated to vehicles, which meant that command posts were beginning to lose climate control, electronic warfare emitter operation, and in some cases lighting. Field kitchens were going cold. Medical evacuation routing was being recalculated around the assumption that ambulances might not make the return trip. And the units in the deepest forward positions, the ones who depended on the longest distribution tails, were beginning to receive radio traffic that contained more apologies than instructions. I want to be precise about what happens to a fighting force in this condition, because the popular framing is that they simply run out of fuel. That framing misses the actual mechanism. What they run out of first is not fuel. It is the freedom to choose where to spend the fuel they have. A battalion with 12 hours of diesel does not behave like a battalion with 72 hours of diesel and 1/3 the supply. It behaves like a battalion that has lost the ability to maneuver, the ability to displace, the ability to evacuate, and the ability to reposition reserves all at once. Every vehicle movement becomes a decision that forecloses other decisions. Counterattack options collapse. Defensive depth collapses. The unit becomes reactive, fixed, and predictable, which on this battlefield is the precondition for being targeted and destroyed at the convenience of the opponent. The fuel crisis was not a logistics problem. The fuel crisis was a tactical immobilization event delivered through the logistics system, and that distinction is what made it so dangerous. Russia's response in the second and third day of the crisis demonstrated, in fairness, both real competence and the limits of competence applied to a problem whose solution lay outside the available time frame. Strategic fuel reserves were authorized for release. Truck convoys were assembled from rear areas in Rostov Oblast and pushed northwest. Helicopter resupply was attempted in limited quantities to the most critical positions. Civilian fuel infrastructure inside occupied Luhansk was commandeered. None of this was foolish. All of it would have worked given enough time. The problem was that the consumption clock at the front was running faster than the resupply clock at the rear, and every hour that gap remained open was an hour in which forward positions became less defensible, more fragmented, and more dependent on individual unit improvisation rather than coordinated planning. The strategic reserve trucks took 2.5 days to arrive at intermediate staging areas. By that point, 3 forward positions had already been quietly abandoned, 2 more had withdrawn under local initiative without higher authorization, and 1 battalion commander had made the unilateral decision to consolidate his unit into a single defensive perimeter and stop conducting any movement at all until fuel arrived. That decision likely saved his unit. It also surrendered approximately 4 kilometers of frontage without a shot being exchanged. This is the cruel geometry the Russian command faced once the operation reached its mature phase. Hold the existing positions and watch them become indefensible as mobility collapsed. Withdraw to consolidated positions and surrender ground that had been paid for in casualties measured in the thousands. Neither option restored the one quality that had been lost, which was the freedom to make logistics decisions on an operational timeline rather than a tactical one. A force that must decide its supply priorities by sundown is not a force conducting a campaign. It is a force conducting triage. And triage, sustained across a frontage of 90 kilometers, is not a recoverable posture. It is a precursor to either local collapse or a managed retreat that the commander hopes to characterize as a regrouping. The strategic lesson here extends well beyond Luhansk, and I want to be careful in stating it because the easy version of the lesson is wrong. The easy version says that long-range strike has made logistics hubs untenable. That is not the lesson. Logistics hubs have been targets in every war fought in the last century, and armies have always found ways to operate them under threat. The real lesson is that the hub-and-spoke architecture itself, when combined with rail dependence and seasonal mobility constraints and electronic warfare reallocation, creates a correlated stress profile that a sophisticated opponent can engineer toward a single, decisive operational window. The vulnerability is not in any single node. The vulnerability is in the topology. Russia was not defeated in Luhansk by superior weapons. Russia was defeated by a logistics architecture that had been allowed to optimize for peacetime efficiency assumptions inside an active wartime environment, and by an opponent who understood that the architecture itself, not its individual components, was the target worth striking. Every military institution watching this war should be asking itself a set of questions, and I will leave you with them because they are the questions I cannot stop turning over myself. How many of our own logistics architectures are still built around the hub and spoke model that served us in conflicts where deep strike was an adversary capability we did not have to plan against? How much of our redundancy is real redundancy, and how much of it converges at marshalling points we have not bothered to count? When was the last time we tested our supply network against a correlated stress event rather than against a single point of failure? And if a competent opponent were studying us the way Ukraine studied the Russian rear in Luhansk, mapping our rail bottlenecks, our pumping stations, our truck loading bays, our generator dependencies, what would they see that we have not seen ourselves? The road outside Svatova is quiet now. The fuel that did not arrive has been accounted for in the ledgers. But the architecture that failed there is not unique to the army that built it, and the operational logic that exposed it is not going to remain a Ukrainian secret. Who in your own institution is responsible for noticing that?